Right. Hey there, this is Layla Benitez James with Telltale Poetry, doing our first interview outside of the US. I'm here with Canisia Lubrin, who is a writer, critic, editor, and professor. She teaches creative writing at OCAD University and the University of Toronto. Her work can be found in Poetry London, Brick, Poets.org, Globe and Mail, and many, many other venues. Lubrin was poetry editor at Humber Literary Review and serves as an advisor to Open Book. Her fiction appears in the Unpublished City, an anthology curated by Dionne Brand, which was a finalist for the 2018 Toronto Book Award, as well as the Journey Prize Anthology in 2019 and 2020. CBC named Lubrin to its list of 100 Canadian authors to know, 6 Black Canadian authors to watch, 14 Canadian poets to watch in 2018, and 18 Canadian women authors to watch in 2018. In 2020, the Writers' Trust of Canada awarded Lubrin a Rising Stars Prize, and she is poetry editor with Canadian Press, McClelland Stewart. Lubrin was educated at York University and the University of Gwelph. Her books are Augur, that came out in 2017, which was a finalist for the BpNichol Chapbook Award, and Voodoo Hypothesis, which I have here and is lovely. And that was named a CBC Best Book of the Year and was finalist for the Gerald, Lampert, and Pat Lowther Award, and shortlisted for the Raymond Souster Award. And then the book that we're mainly going to be talking about today is the Dyzgraphxst, which was named a 2020 Best Book by Quill Quire, CBC Winnipeg Free Press, Rebel Women in Lit, among other places. Her debut fiction, Code Noir, is forthcoming from Knopf Canada, and the Dyzgraphxst is currently on the long list for the 2021 OCM Bocas Prize for Caribbean Literature. Lubrin was born in St. Lucia and now lives in Toronto, Canada. Canisia, thank you so much for joining us today.
Layla, a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to talk about your book, and I wanted to jump in with a kind of a big question about how you put it together on the whole. I really loved how it was divided into acts like a play. And each of those has a title like Ain't I the Ode, Ain't I Too Late? And the whole book itself is just called a poem. And I'm wondering how the collection was organized and how it came to be, how it unfolded within that drama framework, and how did you arrive at those forms?
So the simplest way to put it is that the concept led to the form. The structure itself of a 7-act play follows the form of the poem. But the book itself started as a kind of, I had been commissioned to write a few poems for 3 or 4 magazines. And then when I revisited those poems, I saw that they had quite a lot in common thematically and in terms of their subject, and the experiment in them was looking at how language is actually embodied and enacted. And so the question became, what is a self? How does the self perform its personhood, given the history and the present that a Black woman like myself is alive in? And I was reading Christina Sharpe's In the Wake on Blackness and Being, and it clarified to me some things that I've been thinking about for a long time, which to realize that something is actually part of your sensibility and the way that you think about things is a great gift, And so Christina's idea of dysgraphia as being part of the what she calls the orthography of the wake, and to be in the wake post transatlantic slave trade,
Mhm.
is to exist in her estimation in a kind of dysgraphia. And she says this is it takes the form of a narrative of, you know, sort of criminality and pathology and that kind of stuff attached to Black people, and then those narratives sort of spread in the media in this sort of repetitive way. And so that sense of language for me as a thing that can enact these kinds of violences, because that it essentially, when we talk about narrative, we're talking about language, and the materials of language being put to a particular use. And so that became, you know, the kind of thematic and conceptual core. And so the question for me became, if the self is like a series of pressurized performances with actual real world consequences, what does that say about who we are as a species? What does it say about how language does its work? And for me, I was really disinterested in the lyric I. And so I took the I, the concept of the I, ain't I, ain't I, ain't I, and I split it 7 ways. But I'm addressing, or the speaker of the poem is addressing the self as the self, but also as a collective, right? And so that is what happens when I took the first person I and also used it as second person I and also used it as third person I.
Right. I was
So
just gonna hold up the opening where you have that
yeah,
down.
the
Yeah.
dramatis personae.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, so those sorts of things underpin the form of the book.
Mhm.
So how then do I make all of that concrete and not, you know, some sort of thought experiment? And so the central figure of the book became Jejun, who is sort of where all of the eyes are refracted, but it's also who the speaker of the poem is addressing throughout. And so I borrowed from theater its techniques for making usually really combustive and expansive methods of dialogue
Yeah.
and physical interaction work like a kind of singularity, pulling the voice through. But it's a book about interiority as well. And so I didn't want it to be really self-conscious or self-indulgent and insular. And that's when I came up with the 7 acts of the play. It split the address so that I could look at the various sites of the speaker's concerns, right? Which is the self, the world, and the world's orders, and what that does in terms of kinship, you know? And so that's kind of how the book kind of came together to kind of gesture toward the nature of the imagination when we sort of enter into conflict, into when we live in a world that's living the detriments of climate disaster, nationalism, intensified fascism. And so those things are sort of in the background, and they form the sort of scaffolding of the drama of the play. But the concerns, you know, what's at stake are, you know, for me, investigating the opportunities for transformation that we might hold in relation to one another in the world.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting to hear that that there were separate poems like written with separate venues in mind that all came together,
Yeah.
because there are some like really different moments in the book, but it all comes together really well. But I'm thinking specifically about, you know, I mentioned in an email that Dream 41 that has that kind of like parabola in it, and then your footnote poems, and even just like the detail of like using different fonts. And I wonder if you have not necessarily like maybe kind of an advice for poets who want to work on more experimental projects or invent their own forms, or how did those specific forms like the footnote and then creating, you know, a line that goes to the poem, how did those kind of come together for you? Or was it more like kind of an instinctual that those poems needed that form?
Yeah, I'm really just following my creative instincts.
Nice, yeah.
And I think for me, I'm hyper aware of the way that form operates um, in terms of what we like to think of as tradition in literature. Um, and for me, one of the things that I just could not inhabit as a novice writer or as a writer who's learning um, in an institutional setting, a university and what have you, is the singular sound that the lyric I tended to make, you know, and so that always seemed to be sort of bizarre, and it, in a way, it that created a great deal of discomfort for me. So I was never really able to just sit in it uncritically, and so I'm always trying to find a way for to both be able to express the thing that I need to express and to give it an appropriate shape, form, structure. That to me feels more organic to myself.
Mm.
And so it's against a certain kind of assimilation, a certain kind of literary assimilation. And so I'm following those creative instincts, and then they lead me to the experiment. But in a sense, I think that all writing is fundamentally experimental, because what we do when we enter something, you know, in the realm of writing, is that we are in search of something, or in search of a particular kind of expression that puts pressure on what we already know, and so that we can move past the obvious thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's always a degree of experimentation involved in that. But my own creative instincts um, sort of lead me to find a form that will hold the integrity of the content that I'm putting into the work. So the poem with the sine wave, or the parabola that you're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
um, when I reached the end of the dream and return sequence, the Act 3 that you're referencing, you know, the kind of call and response that was happening in it. For me, and I'm not even sure how to state this in a way that will make a kind of coherent sense. I wanted a sense of hush, a sense of silence, so that parabola is a sort of visual enactment of a kind of silence, but it's not so much the absence of sound; it is the presence of a different kind of fullness of silence. You know, it's a different kind of filling that silent space with something else. So it's a kind of visual redaction for me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in a sense, it's like I've gone through this call and response, which is really looking at how the self enacts desire, and what desire does as a kind of knowledge, how our desires can become weaponized even against ourselves, much less against others, you know. And so that the core of that drama for me, to end it with a poem like that is a kind of warning, a kind of no trespassing sign, that is being critical of itself by redaction. You're right, by saying, okay, maybe I will redact a few of those expressions in the warning. um, but sonically, I'm referencing a river, and visually, I have the parabola, which is in the shape of a kind of
Right.
rivering
Yeah.
through. So it's happening on a number of levels.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe even the word river might have been redacted by that measure.
I
Let me
think
just
it's in
double check.
the, yeah, it's in the end.
Yeah, so the line actually goes through the river. You who
I
come
see
for
it.
me,
Yeah.
take care to be caught in the sudden bend, the flung mouth, this river.
Mhm.
Um, and so a kind of physical, visual gesture of the thing that's actually happening in the poem. Because for me, poems um, are not just about the language, it's also about what's happening beyond the language, what's happening in the imagination that the language pushes open. Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, I'm just following my instincts, and those instincts have to make their own kind of sense, right? It might not be the kind of logic that we tend to lean on and claim comprehension of, but it is it's tethered to the imagination, and what the imagination makes possible. Like even with the footnotes, again, that's also enacting something conceptual, because uh, on a conceptual level, I'm looking again at Black history as, you know, what it is to be a Black woman alive in this moment in time, uh, and to be in oneself, and to be confident in one's personhood,
Mm.
when so much of our history have been made footnotes to
Right.
the
Yeah.
sort of grand dominant narratives that are out there, even though our existence, and everything that we've done and contributed is really fundamental to much of what we encounter in so-called modernity. Yeah. And so for me, the question was, okay, what if the footnote is not a place of minor engagement, but what if the majority of the poem happens in the footnote?
Right. Yeah. And I'll hold up, I mean, I'll link as well to some of these, but
Yeah,
I just love that too. Yeah, the weight of the poem is in the footnote,
yeah,
rather than,
exactly.
yeah.
Precisely so. And then the using the different fonts, the sort of errant
Yeah.
stanzas that are written in a different font to simply suggest um, that there is a kind of there's a multiplicity for both reading and engaging with visually what the poem is doing. So if you read what is in the dominant font of the text, which I think is Centaur or something,
Hmm.
if you read that alone, then you still have a full sense of the poem, um, that you would have if you follow your eye being pulled toward the errant stanza that's in a different font. The poem still works.
Right.
So it doesn't really matter where you put that stanza that's written in a different font. You could put it first, you could put it second, you could put it third, you could read it last, and the poem still has its integrity. So again, this for me, the things that are interesting are not necessarily interesting to the reader, and they might not necessarily be obvious to the reader,
Hmm.
but I open the door. It's an invitation to be hyperactive in the reading process and to have agency, right? I'm saying, reader, you can have agency um, in how you interact with this poem, and you can make the thing what you make of it. So if 400 people read the Dyzgraphxst, they can come away with 400 different poems, and that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that's a good, I mean, that's a good thing to think of for people who are coming to poetry a little bit earlier. Because I've gotten questions a lot about, like how experimental is too experimental, or, that kind of thing, not wanting to lose people. But I think grounding it in your instincts is that's what people need to do. Like if
Yeah,
they have a feeling like something needs to take a certain shape,
yeah,
I think, don't be afraid to lose a reader, because they're just gonna,
yeah,
you might be surprised yourself what a reader comes away with, depending on what it is.
yeah. And
Yeah.
it's also, this sort of obsession with what the author intended, and
Yeah.
if somehow you don't have absolute access to the author's intention, then somehow you've sort of missed out on something. No, I think that if the poem or the work is capacious enough, and because of the nature of its capaciousness, you can find a way to enact whatever it is that your imagination um, needs, requires, offers to experience the poem. Because the other thing that people tend to either disregard or just don't think about at all is the fact that poems are experiential objects. You go to poems for a particular experience of language as well. Like that's one of their functions. But it's more than that, you see. And so go with the imagination first. That's the kind of thing that I like to espouse, that sort of readerly relationship with poetry is go first with the imagination. And then the rest will sort of figure itself out. But the thing about experimentation is, for me, what I like to tell my students is, if you have experimental impulses, the thing you have to do is to actually trust the unknown, because really that's what it is. You don't really know what the outcome will be. Right. You just have a certain impulse or a certain idea that then you follow, right? And so trust the how. If you're trying to figure out the what, and maybe the what is a little bit unclear, then the how keeps you tethered somehow to the thing, and the how might then open up the what for you in these really cool and unexpected ways.
And are there experiments that you push your students towards? Like we were before we started recording, you were saying that you don't really experience writer's block, or you don't think about it as writer's block, but like what do you go to when you need to write then? Or is it just like some impulse is happening and that's it? Or are there any kind of like prompts or experiments that you go to when you're trying to get something out?
No, I don't do prompts at all. And I just don't think writer's block is a thing. I think it's like Bigfoot or Santa Claus, you know?
But what about like if you're...
It's a seductive idea that sort of lets us off the hook for the fact that there's also uncertainty involved in the writer's life, and that's uncertainty is fine. It's okay, you know. So for me, writing is just, it's part of the rhythm of my life. I am never not writing. In a sense, right? In a sense, almost everything you do as a writer, certainly the kind of writer that I am, will eventually lead me to the page. You know, I don't obsess about what that might be. And this is why I don't use prompts personally. But in my teaching, yes, of course, I have to use prompts because it's just one way of organizing the activity of writerly pedagogy. Yeah. And it's a kind of thing that sort of democratizes writing activities in the classroom. And so it makes sense in that context. And I do, and usually when I teach poetry courses, I like to include a unit on poetic experimentalism or poetic experimentation. And really, I just look at different forms that sort of belong under the umbrella of experimental poetry. And I encourage my students to become familiar with those things, the sort of process forms. Yeah. And so like that is a different thing entirely, but I don't, personally, I don't use prompts and things like that. I am in the world, I pay attention to the world, and anything, literally anything could set me writing, right? It could be a conversation that I have with a friend. It could be me overhearing something somebody says. It could be certainly events that have happened that lead me to the work. So my being in the world and paying attention to the world and being attentive and just living my everyday life, there are triggers everywhere.
That's a great way to think about it, as triggers. And something that I loved that you talked about, the difference between writing Voodoo Hypothesis and the Dyzgraphxst. You talked about it, and maybe this is a little bit like that kind of triggering, but also getting it to the page as tearing through a particular kind of darkness, but that the second book was a bit easier or more familiar. And what, I mean, could you compare what it took to get each different book to the page, or was there like different strategies you were using, or was it just kind of like you were at a different time in your writing life?
Yeah, I don't really. So the thing about my writing is that my instincts dominate.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not. I don't have any formulas to offer anyone. I don't have. I don't have that kind of advice. I just, again, I'm available to the world and the world's events and the materials of my living, and that's what I follow. But in terms of the actual process of writing the book, I just make myself available to whatever the book needs. I espouse this get out of the way.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't obsess about how or why, or I've been, for example, a professor was telling me recently that the Dyzgraphxst feels like a project book. Like writers have like this major project book that they tend to devote time to, and I never really thought about it that way at all.
Mm-hmm.
It just has that sort of essence and being where it's doing something that's really divergent. But what the darkness that I was signaling to in Voodoo Hypothesis is located again in the subject.
Yes.
This was a subject about the sort of subjugation of Black people, the continuing subjugation of Black people, how history has a presence and how history actually shapes the present. And I'm looking at all of these systems that enable and perpetuate violence against Black people.
Mm-hmm.
So that is dark. That the subject matter is dark, right? Yeah. In this case, in the case of the Dyzgraphxst, I'm still looking at Blackness in its historical and contemporaneous context, but the materials for me were more philosophical, and located in a kind of intimacy that was not as heavy,
mm-hmm.
right? And so that conceptually is what I was,
right.
It's just it's different. It's a different. The book is working in a different register than Voodoo Hypothesis, but certainly I can see seeds of the Dyzgraphxst in Voodoo Hypothesis.
Yeah, the two works are speaking to each other for sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then in terms of getting your work out into the world, like, submitting books or submitting poems, I mean, you mentioned that you were commissioned to write poems in several places. What is your approach to sending out your work, or is it also just instinctual? Because I know a lot of people try to describe it, sometimes when you're writing to a particular editor, sometimes you'll describe a little bit what your project is. And so I'm wondering are you just sending out work without description, or are you framing it in a certain light?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think so this is what I tell my students, because again, I think this sense of literary citizenship, where one has to publish in journals and magazines and all that. I think that, while yes, sure, that could be a way for one to get one's work out there and to establish a certain sort of relation to a readership, etc. I also think that that's one of the ways that inequalities are sort of reified, in a literary ecosystem that has so many barriers for people who might be doing work that prevailing architecture might not necessarily welcome. So I think each magazine and each journal has its own sort of requisitions, its own policies and such. So what I always say is make sure you read about the magazine that you're pitching to, or that you're submitting to. Look at their submissions guidelines and follow that, you know. And then of course I share do's and don'ts when you're putting together a cover letter and that kind of stuff. Certainly, 1 page, keep it to a page. You don't need to send a 5-page letter.
Oh yeah.
You gesture to why you think your work is a fit for the magazine, etc. And so there's no one answer. It really depends on the magazine. It depends on what they ask you to do in submitting, and of course with your own sort of agency, you can speak to your work. 1 or 2 sentences. I don't send work out to journals. I in the very beginning I did, because again, that is what one is expected to do, and my work was rejected for 4 years straight, and then I just stopped sending work out. And then just before Voodoo Hypothesis was accepted for publication as a manuscript, and that is an unconventional story as well. We don't have the time for, but it was just, I was having a conversation with an editor who became my editor for Voodoo Hypothesis, Paul Vermeersch, and he said, "Why don't you send me something?" And that's how I ended up sending the Voodoo Hypothesis out.
Yeah.
Truly, but just before that, I had like 2 poems accepted in a journal. The very last batch of poems that I sent out, I had 2 acceptances and another acceptance in a different magazine, and then 1 more acceptance somewhere else. So I went from 4 years straight of rejections to 4 acceptances within like a 2-month period.
Wow.
And so I just, for me, it's sitting with the integrity of the work and keeping my head in those pages, and engaging my imagination and my instincts for creating with language. And that's sort of where I've stayed. And so when Voodoo Hypothesis came out, then suddenly I was getting requests from all over. Oh, send us work, even from the same journals who were rejecting the exact same things that I sent out, and then they eventually accepted. It's kind of in, that kind of thing. And so again, and then when Voodoo Hypothesis, the Dyzgraphxst came out last year, that sort of found a much bigger range of reception, I think, than Voodoo Hypothesis had in a comparable space of time. And so I got like a deluge of requests all over again. So that seems to be the thing. And I have written, a ton for me, because I have a million things to do. And so even 5 requests will seem like a ton. But I've had requests that have come my way, and I've written and sent work out by request. So I'm not really engaged in sending work out to journals as I did in the beginning, trying to publish work.
That's great though. I mean, that's I think that's an inspiring story to have, persevered through 4 years, and now you don't have to engage with submitting stuff. You just have to see what you have to say no to and yes to, which is good.
Well, I don't know if it's really saying what I have, choosing to say yes or no. Yeah, certainly there's always that, but it's just for me, I want to write books, and I focus on 1 book at a time. That's it, and so I don't really feel drawn to sending work out like in that particular kind of way. So maybe, like, for example, I have a book of short stories coming out with Knopf. The K is not silent. Knopf. It's so funny. And I'm working on those, and I've been asked by a few places to submit stories, and then they've published them, and several of them have been nominated for prizes and stuff like that. But that's not really what I'm focused on. I'm focused on the wholeness of the work, and I'm putting all of my energies in there. And I just trust that when the book comes out, that it'll find some kind of resonance with folks, you know. And so I think I just have a different relationship to publishing than most people, you know. But I certainly encourage my students and, you know, other emerging writers to do what feels right for them. And journals are like, that's one way. Certainly that's one way to do it. But yeah, it's not a regular part of my practice.
Mm-hmm. And then we're coming close on time, but are there any favorite poets that you'd like to recommend that people don't read enough? Especially because I think a lot of our people in the telltale poetry community certainly are mainly US based. Are there people that you would recommend that you absolutely love? I know Dionne Brand is one that we've talked about, but who else are you reading that you love?
So I'm reading a few books right now. Vievi Francis
Yes.
is phenomenal. Certainly pick up some Vievi Francis, although I don't really, the framing of, you know, people don't read enough of, or people should read X, Y, or Z. That framing is always troublesome for me. Mainly because I don't view poetry in this sort of transactional, broadly applicable way. Like, honestly, what you need to do is read broadly enough that hopefully you find a poem, or you find a poet whose work you fall in love with,
Yeah.
whose work gives you, you know, all of the nutritive and you know, imaginative and powerful sense of the world that kind of makes you want to be a better person, or, you know, that kind of makes you hyper aware of the goodness, even though you know, the sort of complexity of the world we have means that we have to be pay attention to the fullness of things, and those things are not always easy, right? There's a lot of difficulty out there, but I think poetry has a particular way of enriching us beyond the sort of terrors and the brutalities that are out there. And so certainly Vievi Francis has been fabulous for me. I'm reading her Forest Primeval, almost done right now. Araceli Germain, who wrote The Black Maria.
Yeah.
Her work is fabulous. Suvankam Tamavongsa is a wonderful poet, wonderful Canadian poet, who writes just fabulous minimalist poetry. Just the most startling insights, you know, with like the fewest engagements with words there. That's just really fabulous. Safia Sinclair is a poet sister. Natalie Diaz is a poet sister.
Yeah.
Nicole Seeley is a poet sister. Reading Emner Bessie Phillip is always a good idea.
Her work really came to mind when I was reading the books, definitely.
Okay. Yeah, that's always a great idea to pick up some Norbese. Vladimir Lucien, Sounding Ground, I think is a really special, fabulous book. It just made a sound that I hadn't seen before in Caribbean poetry. And so Sounding Ground, I think, is a really fabulous text. So many, but those are the ones that I'm sitting with right now because I'm planning a course.
Oh, lovely. Yeah, no,
Um,
great list. That's many really good names.
yeah, and yeah, oh man, so many. But you know, I am I'm blanking out on several right now. Even just yesterday, I was with uh, Nor Naga's Washes Pray, and it's also a lovely debut book. Check that out. Yeah. So, but what I could do is send you maybe email you a list of some other ones.
Oh yeah, that'll be lovely. I mean, and
Maybe.
yeah, we'll include some links for sure. I love sharing just like a wide range and
Yeah.
make a book
Oh,
as well.
Phoebe Wang.
Hmm.
Phoebe Wang's admission requirements is wonderful.
Okay, great. Well, Canisia, thank you so much for being with us today, and I'm really excited to check out your short stories as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Good chatting.